I'm going to tackle a question that I think I'm asked about the most on this show. It's all about image sizes on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit the form right there on the site. I just might pick your question and answer here on a future show. You may have noticed something different. You can't quite put your finger on it. I'm actually on the road right now, so I'm in a hotel room making the best of it. I promise you next week I'll be right back in my studio in New York City, back in the sweet home confines of New York. Now, for this episode, I've got two questions sent in about the same topic. The first one is from Eduardo R. I'm confused about image resolution when opening a RAW file in Photoshop. What is the purpose of the image resizing menu at the bottom of the screen when the photo opens in Camera Raw? And Tendai S said, "Hi David, thank you for doing what you do. I'd like to know what size images I should deliver to my clients." Both of these questions are about how image sizes work, and it can be a bit confusing until you wrap your brain around it. I do get a lot of questions about this topic, but it's been a few years since I've talked about it, so let's see if I can help. Now, when someone mentions the size of a digital photograph, there are two things they could be talking about. One is the resolution of the image, and the other is the size of the resulting file. Now, these two things are related, but they are also completely different. I do think the more important one is image resolution. That refers to the pixel dimensions of the photo. I'm sure you know that a digital photo is made up of individual pixels. They are really, really small, and modern digital cameras have millions of them on that tiny sensor. Now, technically, they're called photosites or photodiodes. When you take a picture, each one of those tiny little photosites collects some of the light. After that analog light is collected, it's converted to digital data by the computer in the camera. Each photosite becomes a pixel in the image. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying the process, but you don't need to be an electrical engineer to at least understand the basics. Anyway, if you don't do anything to that image, it's going to give you a photo that has a specified number of pixels in it. The native file from my Canon R3 body, for example, is exactly 6,000 pixels across by 4,000 pixels down. And if you do the math, 6,000 times 4,000 is 24 million. That means that a photo straight out of camera from the Canon R3 is made up of 24 million pixels. What's another word for a million pixels? Megapixel. So the Canon R3 is a 24 megapixel camera. Now, each camera is different. The Canon R5 natively produces a file that's 8,192 pixels across by 5,464 pixels down. That multiplies out to 44,761,088 pixels. The camera manufacturers' marketing departments like to round up, so they'll say the R5 is just 45 megapixels. Anyway, the resolution of a photo is simply how many pixels make up that image. Now, just because you use the Canon R3 doesn't mean that every final image is going to have a resolution of 24 megapixels exactly. If you shoot JPEGs, for example, you do have the option of choosing lower resolutions inside the camera while you're shooting. Large is the full 24 megapixels, medium is 11 megapixels, small 1 is 5.9, and small 2 is 3.8. Now, of course, different cameras are going to have different options as far as that goes, but that's how it works in the R3. Personally, I don't recommend shooting smaller file sizes. Why not use all of the resolution that's available to you in these beautiful modern cameras? You can always reduce the size in post-processing if you want. It's almost like buying a high-end sports car just to drive to the store and back. It seems like a waste. Also, I only shoot RAW files, and those are always going to be full resolution. So far so good, right? Pretty simple? Well, now is where it gets a little confusing. I talked about the Canon R3 having 24 megapixels that come from the sensor, and the R5 has 45 megapixels. But the sensor itself is the same physical size in both cameras. So that means the R5 crams nearly twice as many pixels into the same space as the R3. How does it do that, right? They do that by either making the photosites themselves smaller or placing them closer together. In most cases, they actually do both of those things. Sidebar here, all things being equal, bigger photosites do a better job collecting the light, so having fewer pixels that are bigger is generally going to give you a higher quality image than having more pixels that are smaller. However, all things are never equal, right? There are other important factors that affect image quality, including the camera processor and the quality of your optics. We're also seeing more and more computational photography today where you can pull a lot of quality out of images even with very small pixels. But that's a discussion for another day. I just want to make sure we understand how image sizes work. So now let's move off of the sensor and we've got our photo in the computer. Let's say it's 6,000 by 4,000 pixels from that R3. Now, unless I crop that image, it's always going to be made up of 24 million pixels. But since they're no longer confined by the physical size of the sensor, we can make that image bigger or smaller, maybe for display on a website or even for print. I can now choose how tightly packed I want those pixels to be. If they're super close together, the image is going to be smaller. And if I spread them out apart, it's going to be bigger, even though it's the same number of pixels. That makes sense, right? The common unit of measurement for this is PPI, or pixels per inch. That's just what it sounds like, how many pixels there are in each inch of the photo. Here's a photo that I've already saved as a JPEG. It's from a Luke Combs show a couple years ago, and I was using the Canon R3 and RF 24-70 2.8 lens. When I go to image and then image size, this is in Photoshop, you can see the pixel dimensions of the photo. It's 6,000 across by 4,000 down, 24 megapixels. Now where it says resolution, it's at 100 pixels per inch, that's PPI. So right now this picture has 100 pixels crammed into every inch. You can see that it's 60 inches across. 6,000 pixels total with 100 pixels used in every inch means that the photo is 60 inches wide. Then 4,000 divided by 100 PPI is 40 inches down. If you look at the rulers in Photoshop, you can see that this image is 60 by 40 inches. Now, sorry about the math. I know I didn't warn you there was going to be math here, but I did try to keep the numbers as simple as I possibly could. Now, let's see what happens when I go back into image size and change the PPI from 100 to 1,000. The total number of pixels doesn't change. The image is still 24 megapixels, 6,000 by 4,000, but now I've got 1,000 pixels squeezing into every inch. 6,000 divided by 1,000 is 6, and 4,000 divided by 1,000 is 4. So that same 24 megapixel image is now only 6 by 4 inches instead of 60 by 40. Does that make sense? It's up to you to choose how spread apart you want those pixels to be. Now be aware that resample needs to be unchecked. That should really be called resize, because checking it means that it's going to change the number of pixels to whatever you specify. If I change it to 6 by 4 at 500 PPI instead of 1,000, after I hit OK, the new resolution of the photo will be half the size of before. It's now only 3,000 by 2,000 instead of 6,000 by 4,000. Now, why would you change any of this? Well, I already mentioned that you might do it for display on a screen or to make a print. There is another measurement called DPI, and that's dots per inch. That's really used for inkjet printing, where the printer literally shoots millions of dots of ink onto the paper to create the print. I've heard people incorrectly use PPI and DPI interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Today, I'm just talking about PPI. When you're making a print, you need to make sure that you have enough pixels so that you can get the size print that you want while not spreading your pixels out too much. The more you spread them out, the more chance you'll be able to see the individual pixels in the print. When they're tighter together, our eyes tend to blend them so that we can't see any pixels. Now, viewing distance also does make a difference. Let's say you have your 24 megapixel image and you wanted to make a crazy big print that was 600 by 400 inches. That's kind of insane. But to do that, you have to spread out to 10 pixels per inch. Again, it's that same 24 million pixels. They're just spread out far enough so that the print is 600 by 400 inches. At 10 PPI, you're definitely going to see the pixels when you're looking at it up close, but you probably won't be standing next to a 600-inch wide print. That's 50 feet. More likely, you'll be standing 30 or 40 feet back to see that whole thing. At that distance, the photo is probably going to look smooth. Billboards, for example, use a very low PPI to make them super large, but you're probably seeing them from 3 blocks away, so you really can't tell. Okay, so now that you've got that down, let me answer the specific questions. Eduardo asked about the camera raw image resizing menu in Photoshop when you open a raw file. It's basically the same as the image size setting, but it saves you a couple of clicks by doing it when you open a raw file. You can preset things like your color space, your bit depth, and your image size right there. If you click it, it's going to open up the default settings. Let's say you know that you're going to be resizing a huge batch of images to 3,000 by 2,000 pixels at 100 PPI. Just check resize, set width and height where you want, and then PPI. Now you can see how it changed at the bottom, and the photo is only going to be 6 megapixels once you open it. That's 3,000 by 2,000. Personally, I don't do any resizing in Camera Raw because I'd rather make the change later if I need to, depending on what the circumstances are. And then Tendai asked about what size to deliver images to clients. In most cases, I'm going to just deliver the highest resolution I have. If I shoot a 24 megapixel file, I might crop it a bit, but I'm not going to do any resizing. The client can easily make it smaller or change anything they need with the PPI based on how they're publishing it. The only exception to that, I think, would be is if a client specifically requests a certain size because they're publishing it on social media or something like that, then you might want to resize it so it's exactly the size that they want and nobody has to mess with it. The tricky part is if the client needs a file that has more resolution than you have. Maybe they want something that's 12,000 by 8,000 pixels and you only have 6,000 by 4,000. Removing pixels is easy, but any software that you use to add pixels has to guess what to add. You can't go back and recapture the data that should have been in between those pixels. However, technology is getting so much better now. Photoshop has an AI tool in Camera Raw called Super Resolution that's going to double the image size. Most of the time, though, I'll just send the file that I have and let them do what they need. A good printer really can do wonders. Now, one more thing, I said at the beginning that people sometimes confuse image resolution with the size of a file. Every file on your computer does take up some space, and that's measured in bytes, megabytes, and gigabytes. A simple JPEG might be 2 megabytes once you save it, while a layered TIFF file could be 200 megabytes. Those numbers don't really tell you anything about the resolution of the image. You can't tell how many pixels are there just by the size of the saved file. Megabytes and megapixels are different things, but I can see how people do get them confused. You might have a website that takes image uploads and it'll say not to send images bigger than 3 or 5 megabytes. That's mostly a holdover from the old days when storage space and bandwidth were at a premium, so they wanted files that didn't take up too much space on their hard drives. But you can have a very high resolution image with many megapixels that has a small file size of just a few megabytes and vice versa. So that's how that works. I hope that answers those questions and maybe helps some of you to wrap your brain around this stuff. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember, you can send in your own photo questions to askdavidbergman.com. If you like these videos, I always appreciate you hitting that like button and, of course, subscribing to the Adorama YouTube channel right down there. Click that bell icon so you're notified when new shows come out from myself and all the hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll be back in my studio next time. I won't be here in a hotel room, but I hope you'll come back and join me right here on Ask David Bergman.